If we start thinking about how generative AI can impact healthcare, I think that opens up completely new way that AI can be integrated in the way that those companies work. Especially I think it's going to be interesting to see how it can be impacted on not only within the back office of healthcare organizations, but actually on the ground in the relationship between patients and physicians and the way that it's used in the patient interaction.
Hi, I'm Chris Malone, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to once again welcome our friend, colleague, and my co-host for today, Michael Giuliano. Michael is president of Planetree, which is a global not-for-profit organization dedicated to humanizing healthcare for everyone through person-centered care. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone to this December episode of Humanizing Healthcare. It's great to have you with us. It is also my great pleasure to introduce Gianluca, who is an entrepreneur, author, and speaker with an expertise in artificial intelligence and AI ethics. Gianluca is the founder of AI Academy, an AI training and consulting company that has worked with companies large and small to introduce artificial intelligence to improve efficiency and outcomes. Gianluca is the author of Zero to AI, a non-technical, hype-free guide to prospering in the AI era. And you can find Gianluca sharing his latest insights at Harvard's Executives Education programs, via his TED Talk, and in frequent writing and speaking appearances around the world. So it's my great pleasure, and this will be an exciting podcast discussion with Gianluca about artificial intelligence. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michael. And I'd also like to welcome our sponsor, Steve Peltzman, CEO of Feedback Now. And if you've ever seen the happy and sad face buttons in an airport security line, retailer, or restroom, those may be very well from Feedback Now. And they're actually connected to a robust operations and data analytics network. This comprehensive solution takes real-time data from across healthcare operations and highlights where teams need to focus to improve patient experiences and reduce nurses' non-clinical workload. Thank you for supporting us, and thank you for joining us today, Steve.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Let's get started then. Gianluca, we would love to hear the story of how you found a passion for working in artificial intelligence. You grew up and started your education in Rome. What brought you to technology and the whole AI scene?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. Super excited to spend some time talking about AI together. So the story is pretty fun. When I was in university, at some point I decided that I wanted to have a different experience. And so I moved to Belgium and I started studying there. And when I was in Belgium, I got infected by the bug of entrepreneurship. And I got super interested in how entrepreneurs could use technology to solve people's problems. And through that, I managed to win a scholarship from the Italian government that flew me to Silicon Valley. So 10 years ago, roughly, thanks to an entrepreneurial project and idea that I had, I was able to be funded to go to Silicon Valley with this idea of trying to absorb as much as I could from that place, learn as much as possible when it comes to entrepreneurship and how to start companies, and then come back to Europe and try to give back a little bit of that knowledge. And at the time, this was 2014, 2015. It's so funny because I was used to say that AI was exploding, and it felt like it was exploding at the time, but now it feels like it was maybe a little tiny explosion. Now maybe we have, a nuclear bomb or something like that. But it was truly fascinating for me as somebody passionate about technology to see how there were a few things, a few components of this technology that didn't work before, but during that time we were starting to see them working and being used in real products. So I started connecting with a lot of people in the Bay Area. I remember meeting the director of research at Google Brain at Stanford and just talking to him and asking him, how do I get started? Like this thing seems crazy, and I want everybody to know that this is so powerful and anybody should use this. And so him and a few other people helped me get started. So when I came back to Europe, I had this mission of helping anybody understand how this technology worked and find opportunities in their businesses. And that's what I've done basically for the past 10 years of my life. So I got infected by another bug over there, and I still haven't healed maybe.
Very interesting.
And Gianluca, it's great to see you again and have you on this discussion after you provided the keynote presentation at the Planetree Person-Centered Care Forum in New Orleans early in October. And it's great to continue the discussion because you did so well at bringing sometimes out of reach concepts to the everyday person about AI platforms and LLMs and all these different abbreviations. So can you just, for us again, explain those generative AI platforms and what they can and cannot do in sort of relatively simple and straightforward language for us to set a great foundation for the discussion?
Absolutely. So the metaphor that I always use for any AI technology, because we have to remember, generative AI is fairly new. It became sort of the talk of the town a couple of years ago when ChatGPT got launched. But AI as a technology is actually fairly old. So it's been quite some time that people use AI, and I've always used this analogy of looking at AI as a tool. You have a toolbox, and in a toolbox you have a hammer, you have a screwdriver, you may have a saw, and you know what those tools are good for. You will never try to hang a painting on a wall using a screwdriver. You maybe just use a hammer to put the nail on in the wall, right? So in the same way, we have to understand that each AI tool is useful for a specific purpose to solve a specific problem. In the same way that you wouldn't use a screwdriver to put a nail on the wall, you wouldn't use ChatGPT, let's say, to do specific things. So let's try to understand what are the things that you wouldn't do using Gen AI tools and what are the things that you should instead consider doing it. So there's a research paper that I love quoting. This research paper is from Harvard Business School together with Boston Consulting Group, and it's called Navigating the Jagged Technological Frontier. So the title is a bit strange, so we need to understand what that means. What these researchers were trying to understand is what is the limit of generative AI? What do I mean by that? If I take some technology we are used to, like this smartphone, and I tell you, hey, the battery of this phone can last for 2 years and a half on a single charge, do you believe me? You probably wouldn't, because we know that the frontier of the technology battery, okay, is pretty much, a day and a half or something like that. So we have a clear expectation of what is the limit of this technology. With Gen AI, it's shorthand for generative AI, the limit is not that clear. So there are some sort of like simple frameworks that we can use to understand what we can feel comfortable doing and what we should not feel comfortable doing. Let's talk about what is for sure inside the frontier, so what you should feel comfortable doing. There are mainly three kind of applications. The first one is writing proficiency. Generative AI is extremely good at writing. So if you take ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, Google's Gemini, any large language model based tool, their capability of writing stuff is amazing. And I encourage you to just run a quick experiment. Just take any document that you've written and ask it to either rewrite it with a different tone of voice, more formal, less formal. Ask it to make it more fun. Ask it to turn it into a poem. Maybe that's going to be useless, but just to see how good it is at manipulating language. So that's the first one. That's writing proficiency. Second one is creativity. Creativity is actually interesting because a lot of people say, well, how can a model that learns from data be creative? To me, like if it's real creativity or not, doesn't really matter. What matters is the output something we will consider creative? And there's a lot of research that shows that the output of those tools can be considered as creative as a lot of people, a lot of humans. Okay, so for instance, in one case, they asked ChatGPT to come up with ideas for a new business, and they compared those ideas with ideas that students at business schools came up with. And the ideas that ChatGPT produced were significantly better, where better means that they were more likely to be purchased, which is interesting. So it means that even though the process that leads to these ideas may not be what we think is a creative process, it's just statistical analysis in the end of the day, the output is valuable. And the third capability that I recommend you try it out is analytical thinking. Once again, this might not be the same thinking that happens in our brain, but what matters to me is the output. So what I recommend you try is, if you have access to any large language model, let's say you're a physician, take a case, a medical case that you have, or invent one if you want to make sure that you are not, giving away real patient data, and ask it to think out loud about the diagnosis. You will see that the thinking that it makes or that it's simulating, okay, is usually pretty good. So these are the three things that I think you should try out: writing, creativity, and analytical thinking. What should you instead try to stay clear from? Anything that is about pulling real-time data that you really care about being factual. Those systems still have this problem called hallucinations, which means that they can come up with facts that don't exist. All right. And notice how in the first three cases, you're sort of like sidestepping that issue, because in creativity, you don't care if something is factual or not. You care about having new ideas, right? So you're sort of playing safe if you're playing with those three areas. So factual pulling of real time or recent data, stay away from that. Or trying to analyze very different kinds of data at the same time, a lot of text, a lot of numbers. That's something that those models tend to be confused from. They don't know what piece of data to listen to, especially if this data is conflicting. That's something you should pay attention to. My recommendation, just I'm going to close with this, is start experimenting with those more simple capabilities, writing, creativity, and then sort of get a feeling of what works and what doesn't. And then you can sort of move up to more maybe risky, but also potentially more rewarding use cases.
Thanks. That's a great summary. And it's also so interesting to have a technology like AI, like you said, that we don't know what the potential endpoint is. It's sort of just so vast about its potential to solve so many things in our everyday life. And you brought this to the healthcare industry, which we're all very interested in, during the Planetree Forum by showing us the increase in costs in healthcare in the United States relative to other products and services over the past 20 years. And I thought it would be great to bring it up for listeners and for you to sort of bring us through that and discuss some of the trends and why you think this is important from an AI perspective as well.
Yeah, so for me, this is one of the, I don't know, the first word that comes to my mind is sad graphs that I've seen, because it shows how the price of different goods and services evolved in the past 20 years. And as you can see, there's a lot of goods like new cars or clothing, computer software, toys, and TVs that were made exponentially cheaper by technology, basically. Whereas there are a few other services like anything related to basically healthcare and education. These are the two main buckets, right? Where the cost basically became exponentially more expensive. So to me, it's very interesting because it means that technology so far has made cheaper, more affordable, and more democratic services like, TVs, which are great. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love TVs, but I would argue education and healthcare are probably more important, right? And so then what happens is that we have infinite access to free videos through Instagram and TikTok and all these apps, which once again, I love. I do create a lot of content. I like spending time on TikTok or Instagram, but I would argue that maybe technology is scaling maybe the wrong things. Maybe Gen AI, this is my hope, Gen AI maybe is finally the technology that allows us to scale some of those services and products that haven't been scaled by technology before. And this would be, again, in healthcare and in education, which are the two industries that haven't been as helped by technology as others have. Media and entertainment have been completely disrupted. I mean, think about this. Just make a quick example, just to make it really pragmatic. Music. Like, then we can talk about how the industry has been disrupted. But I remember when I was a kid, buying a CD for me was I had to save, and I had to ask my father to drive me to the record store and then buy my Metallica CD that I was really interested in. And right now, I think I pay $10 a month and I have every music that has ever been recorded accessible through this. Now we can talk about how the industry has been completely disrupted. That's a whole different conversation. But what I want to say is, as a consumer, this means that access to music has been exponentially more democratic to me than 20 years ago. Access to healthcare hasn't been touched in the same way. So some of this data shows that actually the opposite happened. So access to healthcare becomes always harder, more expensive for people. I would argue that that's something that probably we should have tried to focus a bit more rather than how to democratize access to music because music is important. I love it. I'm a musician again, but healthcare and education to me are two of the most important things that we should try to make easy for people to access. That's my hope for this new wave of AI, really, to make those services, those tools, those areas more democratic and accessible.
Yeah, we would certainly agree. And so, to what extent have you had the opportunity to work with healthcare organizations so far? And there are any examples that you could share with us of how you're helping them?
Absolutely. So it's actually funny because my background is in energy engineering, so it has nothing to do with healthcare. But my first AI project was in healthcare. I was in Rome and I was hired by a pharmaceutical company, Merck, to to basically try to bring a little bit more innovation in their processes. And one of the things that I found was that they had this thing called a patient support program, where they were basically supporting patients with multiple sclerosis through their therapy. And what I noticed is that there was a lot of data that we had about the services that we were giving to those patients that was not used, and there was a lot of money that potentially could have been used better. It was just a little bit of I call it spray and pray kind of approach. So you have 10,000 patients and do the same thing to everybody, and you hope that you're hitting the ones that actually need help. And so what I did is I tried to use this data. So a lot of work on anonymization, obviously. That was probably the toughest part of that project, actually. And to try to identify out of this pool of patients, which ones needed more help, which ones needed to have more support from nurses, which ones basically we had to focus on. And it was a great project. I loved working on that, and I loved it specifically because I understood the technical side was not too hard. The interesting thing for me was to navigate the specific challenges of healthcare, which is a complex industry and is definitely more complex than, I don't know, entertainment, Facebook or Instagram, that sort of stuff. So that was super interesting. But if we fast forward to now, so this project I told you was 2016, I think. So 8 years later, well, now there's Gen AI, this generative AI. So if we start thinking about how generative AI can impact healthcare, I think that opens a completely new way that AI can be integrated in the way that those companies work. Especially, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it can be impacted on not only within the sort of like the back office of healthcare organizations, but actually on the ground, like in the relationship between patients and physicians, and the way that it's used in the patient interaction. That's something that I'm extremely excited to see.
And so, how did this lead to you writing the book Zero to AI? Well, what inspired you to do that? And what do healthcare leaders need to hear about what's going on in artificial intelligence right now?
The book was part of, it's actually a very funny story. I've always told to my business partner at the time that we had to write a book at some point. It's because we thought, well, me and him, we were flying around and traveling around trying to explain to business leaders in different industries, healthcare was one of them, what is AI and why they should use it. But then we thought, well, I mean, there's a lot more people that should hear about this. And so we decided that we wanted to write a book because it sounded to us like a great way to democratize that knowledge and to make it available for everybody. That was really the goal, this idea of democratizing access to this knowledge. But the funny story is that the book came out on, if I remember correctly, on February 2020. So it was just the beginning of COVID. And so the book came out, and 2 years later, ChatGPT came out. So the book basically had a shelf life of 2 years because ChatGPT was not in the book, right? It didn't exist. The whole technology was, I mean, there were some models that we do mention in the book. They were about generative AI, but it was very far from being useful. Let's put it that way. And so then 2 years later, I had to start telling people, and I keep saying now, don't buy the book. Honestly, it became so outdated because it doesn't mention ChatGPT. It feels so weird. So everything that is in the book is still valuable, but it misses the hot topic of the day. And to me, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because it highlights how important it is to stay on top of what's happening. Because literally, something that is sci-fi today could become a commodity in 6 months. And that's crazy to me because, again, I publish a book and roughly 2 years later, I have to tell people, hey, I don't recommend you buy it until I update it. Or if you maybe buy it, but then you also have to buy this other book, which sort of like compounds that knowledge. So it's been a really fun journey and yeah, rewarding in different ways, let's say, than what I expected.
Well, let's take a quick break to learn a little bit more about feedback now, and then we'll come back to Michael, who's got a couple of more questions for you on this. I think you might find this interesting, particularly as relates to how their technology is going to be a feeder for artificial intelligence. So let's take a look.
Wasting staff resources is expensive. Overstaffing drains budgets, while understaffing risks quality and patient satisfaction. But without real-time visibility, it's impossible to strike the right balance. Instant alerts from Feedback Now notify your EVS team when and where cleanliness metrics change. This data-driven approach allows you to rapidly redeploy resources to maximize efficiency without sacrificing standards. Don't let poor visibility into your operations hold you back. See how real-time insights can transform your hospital at feedbacknow.com.
Thank you for indulging us that. Back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Chris. Gianluca, it would be great to continue our discussion about the healthcare industry and how you see Gen AI platforms transforming the way that patients experience healthcare. And where do you think these tools can help strengthen or diminish potentially the relationship that patients have with their care providers?
To me, we're really just scratching the surface of what's possible. And I love to quote a couple of research studies that I found particularly, I think, interesting, but also challenging to sort of like, really understand and accept. And the first one is about trying to compare the diagnostic accuracy of a physician with what today's tools can do. And there's a few research studies, but there's always been like, this is the state of the art, and then 3 months later, this is the new state of the art, and then this is the new state of the art. So I'm gonna mention you the latest scientific paper I've read. I may have missed some because again there are too many, but this one was particularly interesting because they show how if you take today's technology, specifically they tried GPT-4o from OpenAI with expert prompting. So they used some fairly sophisticated prompting techniques, and they showed that the diagnostic accuracy of that system, so GPT-4o with expert prompting, was higher than, number one, specialized healthcare AI models. So GPT-4o is a general purpose tool, right? It's not specifically made for healthcare. But with this expert prompting was beating models that were specifically trained on healthcare data, which is interesting because it means that, GPT-4o costs $20 a month. Talk about democratization, right? Talk about, getting costs down. But the other thing was that it was not only better and more accurate than specialist models, was also more accurate than the average physician. And that's extremely interesting to me because it opens up like a big can of worms. It starts saying, well, okay, then what is the role of physicians? If physicians do a few different things, but one of the reasons why I go to a doctor is because I have some symptoms, and I want to know what do I have, and what is the therapy, right? And if now suddenly I have a thing, because AI, it's a thing. It's kind of funny because a lot of people refer to it as a he or a she, but we need to remember it's an object, okay? It's a thing. So now we have something that is better than someone at making that diagnostic activity, let's say. And so you may start thinking, and this is what actually I told my sister is a doctor. She graduated a couple of years ago. She's doing her residency, and I told her when she graduated, well, even though I work in AI and I know that AI is coming for your diagnostic accuracy, the human touch, that's where you need to focus on. But then there have been some other research studies in which they compared written answers given to patients. These were written either by physicians or by AI models in both a chat-based interface. So imagine you're sending WhatsApp messages to a doctor, or sort of like a one-off kind of email kind of interaction. And in a blind testing, people, like real humans, rated more empathetic the answers coming from the AI than the answers coming from the doctor. And it feels crazy, but when you look at the data, it actually does make a lot of sense, because the average answer from a physician was, I think, 50 characters long, something in that ballpark. It's really hard to be empathetic with 50 characters. It's really hard. And I actually had this conversation with my sister. She was telling me that they have really little time after a patient passes away to just put a new patient on that bed, because they need to use their resources effectively. But how can you be empathetic with the family if you just need to fill that bed? And in the same way, how can you be empathetic with a patient that is sending you a text message if you have a list of patients outside of your door? So it seems to me that what is happening now is that suddenly AI has this huge potential to start taking away a little bit of that burden from those physicians, from nurses, from basically anybody in the industry, and then have those people focus more on what they actually can do best. Because I do not believe, I refuse believing that the future is doctors don't talk to patients and AI does the whole thing. And I don't believe that AI is actually more empathetic than doctors. I believe that AI is more empathetic than today's overworked, stressed doctors. So my hope is that AI can take some of the burden away, and then doctors can actually perform in the way that they can. So using what makes them unique, which is the fact that they are human beings with beating hearts, right? So now this is what research tells us. This is, to me, a direction. It's not a clear path to get to this ideal state. What do I mean by that? I mean that the devil is in the details, So even though I'm saying that AI could take the burden of doctors, how exactly, what is going to be the patient experience, how is it going to be integrated, that's still uncharted territory that we need to start figuring out together. But what we cannot absolutely ignore, it will be honestly it would be such a shame, and I will argue maybe even unethical, to ignore this trend, because the potential is there. It's like having a new drug that can cure a disease and you decide to not use it because it's too powerful. It makes no sense to me. You have to start, looking at it with curiosity and trying to answer those questions about the how, not the if. The question is gone. The if you should use it is yes. That's it. Let's not talk about it. Now the question is how, and that's where I want more people to get into the conversation.
And that's probably a great primer for my next question, which you've touched on sort of already, which is that healthcare is a human business and it requires interactions between humans and human touch and human connection. And sometimes we feel like there's this risk that AI will just come over and remove the human because it's easier and quicker and it takes less time for a computer to do it. So what are sort of like your 3 recommendations for the healthcare industry to avoid that from happening, but find this nice balance, as you're talking about, where AI can support and reduce overworking to bring our clinicians back to the bedside and back to the human connection?
That's $1 billion question, right? It's something that has to be solved, and it's definitely not trivial. I think a few recommendations that I can give are, number 1, let's remember that AI is a tool, okay? So a hammer is not gonna wake up in the morning and just have, decide to stand up and put and hang my paintings. A hammer needs somebody who has agency and decides to use it in the right way. So AI is not going to by itself decide to take over an industry. So we have control, we have the free will to decide how to use it, when to use it, when not to use it. So that's number 1. Remember, you are in control, right? There's this idea of disruption. Technology comes in and disrupts. It's not true. It's humans who take the technology and disrupt industries. So you can be one of those humans that disrupts, or one of those humans that decides to maybe have a bit more of a conscious approach. So number one, remember that it is a tool. Number two, I think look for areas where there's friction in the patient experience. So and you're gonna find plenty, obviously, and start prioritizing and thinking, okay, these are the areas where we see this friction and where maybe the human touch is not that necessary. An easy example that we've seen a lot of applications in is note taking, right? So that's an example where we don't need to have a doctor just transcribe everything has been said. It's an easy case in which you can see AI playing a role. And last thing is, remember to be patient-centric. So there are some cases where AI can maybe take over something that the doctor does, but ask yourself, should it? Because sometimes you have a patient preference. It's very interesting. I always when I do keynotes, I often ask this question, and I did that also in the Plane Tree conference in New Orleans. I always tell people, imagine that you really need to have an accurate diagnosis, either you or somebody it's in need of something is sick, has something wrong, and needs to figure out the right diagnosis. You can choose a doctor that is 95% accurate or an AI that is 98% accurate. It's a thought experiment. You have two options, 95%, 98%. Which one do you pick? Every time I ask this question, 50% of people pick the doctor, 50% of people pick the human, which means that if you're picking the human, you're deciding consciously to decrease your odds of surviving. For this specific thought experiment, all right? If you have 95 and 98% accuracy. So it means that people do want to have the human touch, even though it's irrational. And to me, being irrational is not a negative thing. We're animals. I always tell people we're monkeys with an iPhone. Okay, so we need to acknowledge that there's an emotional component we need to take into account. So even though in some cases, in some parts of the healthcare experience or the patient experience, AI might be able to take over, always ask yourself, yeah, but do patients want that? And if the answer is no, then you need to find a way to still leverage the power, the diagnostic power in this case, but keeping the experience human and keeping the experience something that patients are actually looking forward to, rather than being a bit weirded out by.
What do you think are some of the most important questions healthcare leaders should be considering as their organizations start to implement generative AI tools? Are there any particular risks or opportunities that you think they should be focused on?
I recommend having a portfolio approach. What do I mean by that? The potential opportunities are so many, from automation of back office tasks to, again, the patient experience and anything in between. So what I recommend is to have an experimental approach. To start, if you want to be very pragmatic, it would be ideal to start a task force. So a group of people that has this task of trying to experiment and coming up with ideas and testing those ideas. And that's the second recommendation I have. Be pragmatic. Don't be afraid to experiment. An experiment could be as easy as a little ChatGPT prompt that you try to test in a fake patient interaction. Maybe don't try it immediately with your real patients. Maybe try it, in an experimental setting, but do that experimentation. And the third thing that I have to say, so portfolio approach, be pragmatic and experiment with real tests, all right? Don't keep it too vague. Actually go and try it out. The third one is obviously education. And I don't say it because that's what I sell, but I sell it because that's what I think, if that makes sense. I want people, I think people have to be aware of what the technology can do. And I think a great example of this is I had a workshop with a client in a different industry, and they told me about pain they had, and 2 days before, I'm not joking, literally 2 days before a new technology had been released, they could solve that problem. If I didn't study and if I didn't know that that technology existed, the outcome of that workshop of that company would have been completely different. So if you're not aware, you don't know what you don't know. Okay, if you're not aware of the capabilities of this technology, of where it's going, then you may be missing out on some amazing new developments. And so invest in your education. Doesn't even have to be expensive. It can be there's a lot of free courses out there that you can take, but do consciously allocate the time to improve your skills and to improve your awareness of what's going on. Because this stuff is pretty powerful, and it would be such a shame to miss out.
Well, as tempting as it is for Michael and I to pepper you with more questions, we've actually got some questions from listeners, and I'd like to turn and take some of those now. From our longtime listener, Dua Hamada from Cleveland Clinic, she asks, how can we personalize the patient's journey through AI? Any suggestions or thoughts there?
It's a really good question. There's a lot of different ways you could do that. My recommendation, instead of giving you a very specific example, would be to try to look at the patient experience and try to see in which part of the patient experience, if you map it, from the beginning until the end, try to find in which parts the patient gets stuck and try to find in which parts personalization or AI could actually benefit the patient outcome. You may find out that in the first point of contact, when sends an email, maybe that's when there's a lot of delay, for instance. So you may want to try to give an AI-based recommendation or answer in the beginning. You may decide instead that the best part where this patient can get a value would be at the end, where there's actually one of our students built a tool where the doctor can write his prescription, his diagnosis, and AI turns that into a beautifully crafted document that is explained in a very sort of layman terms, makes it very easy to understand for the patient. That's at the end of the patient journey. So you could really find a lot of different touch points where you can find that personalization. But again, focus on the problem, focus on the pain of the patient, focus on where it gets stuck in that journey, and then use the tool as a tool. Use AI as a tool to unstuck the patient or to improve those specific elements of the patient journey.
That's a really interesting example and idea from the standpoint that we know a significant portion of patients find medical information very confusing, particularly what they're provided in writing. And so that could be a way to personalize the way that information is shared with them. Another question from Tricia Shoy. She indicates that many healthcare organizations have patient family advisory councils, and she's wondering whether this is a population that has been thought of from an AI standpoint. Have there been data collected or ways that might be able to support them better with AI? Any thoughts there?
I'm not aware of specific research that tackles this, but I will say, the interesting thing is that AI is a general purpose technology, right? It's probably the most flexible technology we ever had. Maybe electricity is more flexible, right? But so then I would argue that even though I'm not aware of any specific research, I would argue that being so flexible, there's definitely ways that you can tackle the specific pain points of the population that you've mentioned.
Interesting. Also a question from Wendy Angelo. I think you assume folks to have an AI mindset, which I think is really crucial in healthcare. How do you suggest getting that AI mindset introduced into an organization to move forward in that change management? Folks have to stop thinking that it's the same as Googling and missing the power of the technology. What's your reaction to that?
This is such an amazing question. To me, probably the biggest bottleneck to AI adoption is not in the technology, is in people's mindset. There's this equation that I have, in my mind, which is AI equals tech plus people. Tech works pretty much, it has to be improved, but it's kind of there. It's people that need to improve their skills and improve and change their habits. And so there's this sort of taxonomy that you can think of where there's an axis, which is your skills when it comes to AI. And you need to be able not just to maybe ask a basic question to ChatGPT, but you need to be able to apply it in your work. So education is key when it comes to that. The other axis is your habits. And your habits have to change. And this is not easy. Like changing people's habits, it's pretty hard. I struggled as well. Like when ChatGPT came out, it took me quite some time to just embed it in the way that I work. Right now, I don't even think about it, but it's normal. Humans have a lot of inertia in the way their brains work, right? And so you need to fight against that. And how do you do that? Well, there's obviously change management is a whole science, right? But my recommendations are, I think these are things that I've said before, but just sort of like to put them into this change management perspective. Number one, learn. If you don't know how something works, if you've never tried it, if you don't understand it, well, then you can't change your habits because you can start using something you don't understand. You're always going to be a little bit afraid. So start with knowledge. Number two, you need to experiment. And in industries like healthcare, where there can be a little bit of resistance for very good reasons, by the way. It's high risk kind of application. I recommend having a sort of like playful approach. What does that mean? Maybe try to run some little experiments for use cases that are low risk. They could be write a LinkedIn post about how your day, something like that. Okay, but that's gonna start making the tool a bit more familiar. Okay, and number three, start thinking about how that could potentially instead disrupt the way that you work. So understand it. Number two, get familiar with it, even though maybe you're using for use cases that are not the ones that you do on a day-to-day basis. But number three, once you have that familiarity and that knowledge, then start thinking about how can I actually truly embed it in the way that I work and potentially change dramatically the way that I work. I will go through those three steps. And from an organizational perspective, there's obviously some structure that you need to do to those initiatives. It's not easy, and I'm seeing a lot of companies have different approaches, but it's something that definitely needs to have some buy-in from a leadership perspective. So if you're in the management of an organization, you can't expect people to have their own initiative and this just happen. So you need to have some sort of guidance from a leadership perspective, so that people are encouraged and have the right tools to build up the skills. And
very good points. Now, I think we're just about out of time. We have maybe time for one more question. It's our favorite and final question. Michael, do you want to serve it up to us?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So, Gianluca, do you have a favorite quote you can share? And if so, why is it your favorite quote?
Absolutely. So this quote, I've been having it on basically all my presentations for years, is the following. The hardest part of getting what you want is figuring out what that is. The reason why I love this quote is because I think it's true in life in general, but it's particularly true, I think, when you're working with artificial intelligence. Why? Because if you want to use it correctly, you first need to understand what are the pains that I want to solve. What are the things that are worth solving? And then you can put AI, AUs to fix those things. Unfortunately, I don't know who said this quote because I read it on a forum. So I need to keep thanking this random guy on the internet who put that quote that really, struck a chord in me. And I keep saying that quote all the time, but I don't know what's the name of that person. So maybe it's listening here. In that case, thank you. I've been stealing your quote for 10 years, and I loved it.
Well, I think that's a really insightful observation, because I think there are things consciously that we think what we want, but emotionally don't actually give us what we thought we were going to get out of it. And so it's this constant tension between what we think we may want kind of rationally versus emotionally what we need and what we will find fulfilling. So it's a great thought to end on. Gianluca, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. For our listeners who are interested in your classes, your podcasts, and other appearances, what's the best way for them to stay connected to your efforts?
So you can either follow me on LinkedIn and just look for Gianluca Mauro, spelled GIANLUCA or you can go on our website, ai-academy.com.
Terrific. To our listeners today, thank you for joining us as well. We hope you found our discussion informative and inspiring. And finally, I'd also like to thank Steve Peltzman and his team from Feedback Now for sponsoring our program. And be sure to join us in the new year for a conversation with Dr. Sunanda Kane, the Chief Patient Experience Officer at Mayo Clinic. It's going to be a terrific conversation. In the meantime, best wishes for happy holidays and a happy new year to everyone.